essay on that verse. It will come out in my Leviticus commentary, if I may offer that as a thought. But most important, again, it is the only law in all 5 books, and it is the only one that God himself gives, the only death penalty in creating the world.
Yeah. And I think what happens is, I understand, some people get completely turned off when they read the law, because all they see is all these people being
death
killed.
Penalties, that's right.
And then they stop thinking about what the laws are about and what it is they're trying to set up.
Thank you. That is why I wanted it to be noted.
Yeah.
It is not meant to be enacted. It is meant, what was the Torah going to say? If you hit your parent, there's 100 shekel fine. I mean, think about it. How does God communicate how serious the parent should be taken? Mm-hmm. You go to jail for a week? I mean, they didn't have jails.
That's right. There's also a situation that they lived in a world where everything was so precarious that if someone fell out of the bounds, there was nothing to do with them. You can't have a mechanism for incarceration.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. So 21:17, it's an extension of the same line of thought with regards to honoring tradition. And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. More variation.
All right, you will love this one, I promise.
If men strive...
Forgive me, I want to do one on the insult. Hebrew insult comes from the root kal, which means light, as in non-heavy. And the word to honor comes from the word kaved, which means heavy. To take your parent, so in other words, taking your parent lightly is the literal translation of curse, and taking your parent heavily is the literal translation of honor.
Oh, that's interesting, because heavy implies something that's deep and profound, right, and in the depths. And so the notion there is that if you take your parents lightly, that you don't build your foundation on the foundation of tradition, and then you'll be light, and then you'll blow away during a storm. So
yeah, beautiful.
If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. Dennis, you discussed including this particular verse, so I'm going to turn that over to you.
Well, very quickly, this is uniquely, no, I don't know if uniquely, but it is a particularly difficult one, because it's an odd law. If 2 men are fighting and by accident, one of them strikes a woman who is pregnant and her children depart from her, then the following happens. It's not exactly an everyday situation. It must have been a specific moment and what the adjudication was. And there is no great clarity here, because it is not clear when it says in the Hebrew, and there be, what is the word that you use, mischief? What is the term?
And yet no mischief follow.
Right, okay, so the Hebrew means damage, generally speaking. Mischief, damage, there are many translations.
Mm-hmm. That means the woman is unharmed, I would say,
no, that we don't know. Is it her or is it the children?
Right, the children, like that she gives birth to the child, let's say.
Well, the children come out, right? So if they are not injured severely or even killed, then you pay what the judge says you pay. And the people who are pro-choice have one take, and people who are pro-life have another. But we have to be intellectually honest. We don't know which it refers to. Is it the woman or the children? That no further damage takes place, or further damage does take place, to be precise. That's all I really wanted to note. That there is not much to be read into this in the pro-life, pro-choice debate, except to say that if you believe the damage is to the children, then clearly that is a statement about the worth of the human fetus. If you say it's only to the parent, then it has no statement about the worth of the fetus, but we don't know whom it is talking about. That's all. That's really important, I think, to note. And by the way, it comes from someone who does believe that the human fetus has worth. But we have to first tell the truth. We can't read Scripture in the light of how we want it to sound. That's what I guess the more important point.
What's interesting is that many jurisdictions recognize the worth of the fetus when it comes to double homicides.
That's right.
But not when it comes to their own, the same jurisdiction's abortion laws. It's a strange paradox.
Yeah, which I've never understood. But okay.
Well, it seems to be a reflection of the same underlying complexity that's tangled up in that verse.
But one thing is clear about the whole burden of this, the whole book of Exodus, is that the family and the process of reproduction and raising children is fundamental to the well-being of the community, and it's protected by huge barriers.
Yeah, and we'll return to that very shortly as we get into chapter 22. 21 continues. This is a very famous line. Everyone knows this virtually. And this is often pointed to by those who are skeptical about the integrity of the biblical text as an indication of the brutality of these archaic societies, but it was actually a limit on violence rather than the reverse. We don't understand how violent these societies could be. Eye for eye, this is 21:24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. 21:25 is burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. An idea here is that the reprisal for mischief and damage should be proportionate, because it could be, well, you trip me and I kill you. And that seems disproportionate. But in societies that were run by an honor code, disproportionate retaliation was the norm, and that rapidly, frequently cycled out of control. And this is a limit on that. You're not entitled to more damage than has been visited upon you.
Is this specifically unpacking the previous law,
right?
Dennis?
But it happens.
Or does it distill
but
the
it also has
logic
it generally.
of proportionality?
It's not the only time that it's mentioned. You're entirely right. But it is not the only time eye for an eye is mentioned. So everything you said is critical. This was a major moral achievement, that an eye is only worth an eye, not a life or not two eyes. Also, the eye of a poor man is no less valuable than the eye of a nobleman or a king. This was a massive statement forward in history. And third, there is no example in the history of the Jewish people of somebody's eye being taken out if he took out somebody else's eye. It was always understood, except for the life part, it was always understood as monetary compensation. It is a statement of principle, however, that an eye is only worth an eye.
Right, so this is a limit, and it's not an injunction to vengeance, it's a limit.
Right.
Okay,
and restricts the punishment to the individual, not the individual's family and
right,
tribe.
right.
Exactly.
And limitation in that regard too.
It contains the retribution.
And what do you make of the Christ statement, which he says if
You have heard it said.
yeah, that if it's an eye for an eye, then we all end up blind and toothless. And so how does forgiveness, in terms of the way the Christian take on this, like how does it play in this?
You're going to open that can of worms at the moment.
Well, we don't have to.
Well,
we don't have to.
That was it, the line of Gandhi's biographer, or he reports Gandhi as saying that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind.
Yeah.
But I think that was just, according to Dennis, would simply be a mistaken, overly literalistic way of
Well,
understanding the principle of proportionality.
A family for an eye leaves everyone dead, and society in tatters. An eye for an eye might leave everyone blind. But I would say, in answer to your question, it might be something like, well, imagine you were very sophisticated about being assaulted. You might say, well, is there any way that I could do good in this situation, despite the fact that I have in fact been wounded? Because, and maybe that's tied into this notion of striving to love your enemy. If you're going to set the world right and you could bring even your enemy back into the path of proper being, is there a way that you could conduct yourself so that what you would do is entice him? I'll tell you a story that just popped into my mind. A woman told me this story when I was in Europe. She was in a city in the Middle East, a naive American tourist, and she was walking back to her encampment, and a man stopped and offered her a ride. to the encampment, and foolishly she got in the car. And he took her out in the desert, and he told her that he had been terribly abused as a child and that he was going to rape her. And he took her into the desert and was preparing to do so, stripped her and laid her on the ground. And when he climbed on top of her, she took him in her arms and told him that she loved him. And he broke down and cried and stopped. And so that's a good example. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Because she got under him. In the psychological sense, right? She managed even in that moment of extremity to look past his voluntary adoption of malevolence and evil, right? And to grab him by the heart and to pull him out of that abyss. And so
it wouldn't have worked with Hitler's or Stalin's torturers.
Hey,
it's critically that it's a great story. I almost cry listening to it. I've never heard it.
It's an amazing story.
But I'm not sure there's much to be extrapolated in the nature of human evil.
Well, it's always an open question, Dennis, because I think it depends to some degree on the canniness of the interlocutor. You know, I would say that if you're going to entice someone malevolent back onto the path of proper being, you have to be as canny in your good as they are in their evil. That's an echo of the notion that you should be as wise as a serpent, right? As harmless as a dove and as wise as a serpent. And I don't know what the limit to that is, because I've seen people in extreme situations walk the path so precisely that they could entice even someone hell-bent on malevolence out of that that insistence. I mean, I take your point. This is no simple matter, and it's nothing for the naive to attempt. But it's always an open question. You know, even when someone comes after you, how much of the outcome is in your control? And the answer is, to some degree, that's proportionate to the depth of your wisdom. So,
with the caveat that if you run across Adolf Hitler, it's probably a good idea to shoot him.
Well, and I would say maybe it's a good idea if you absolutely don't know something better to do. And it's not obvious, even in principle, what would be better to do in that situation. So,
two quick points. First of all, I'm not certain
but he wasn't that. He wasn't.
That it's true that eye for eye,
ending.
according to this, speaking as a Christian, Old Testament logic, leads to everyone blind. I mean, this is actually a way of trying to prevent everyone ending up blind, because it's setting the limits, as you're saying, but you set the limits also by being candid about what the cost is, and if there's no consequence to the cost that's proportionate, then you end up in a completely destabilized world.
True.
But even from the Christian standpoint, speaking as a Christian for the New Testament, there's no sense in the Christian tradition that kind of forgiveness obliterates the reality of the sin. Yeah. I mean, the whole tradition of confession within the Christian tradition, you can only receive you might say, the benefit of God's promise of forgiveness by owning up to what you have done. I mean, you have to name the sin and take responsibility for it. And so this logic of eye for eye is very much internalized to the whole possibility of forgiveness.
And sometimes it's the seriousness of the retribution and punishment that will bring home to the wrongdoer.
Yes.
The penitent wrongdoer.
That's precisely what leads you to weep when you acknowledge your sin.
Exactly.
Well, bring that home for today. In other words, the key, as you say, is proportionality. And here this is against an over-exaggeration. But we're in a culture, say, with prosecutors letting people off, and they're back out in the streets the next day, where the injured party feels there's no proportionality, there's no justice. You know,
that's also an incitement to vengeance on their part,
exactly,
and a placement of the moral burden back on their shoulders. Which that's not a good idea for the stability of society.
There's lots of mitigations here, but you shouldn't miss the fact that this is a hard code, right? It's firm about justice, and that's for the reasons you just stated, right? I mean, first of all, whatever happens to somebody who perpetrates a crime these days is not going to happen for a long time. And that's, too bad. It should be clear.
That sends a signal. It sends a signal about how seriously or unseriously as society and its rulers take immorality and wrongdoing.
So it's also the case possibly that once everybody has accepted the eye for an eye limitation, you might be able to aim for a moral order that supersedes that, but not until that. Right? So this might have been relevant for the time and place and a moral advance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the ultimate moral advance in the realm of potential moral advances.
You can't transcend this without admitting it. I mean, we know this in our personal lives. If someone commits a wrong against you, you can't have any reconciliation without an acknowledgement of that wrong. I mean, that's the beginning of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Right, definitely. 22, Exodus 22. We're going to jump right into 22:16. And if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. I'll read the 22:17 as well. If her father utterly refuse to give her unto him, he shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. Okay, now this is a very interesting rule in my estimation, principle, because this isn't rape. The maid is enticed. She's attracted and does this. It's implied voluntarily, but that nonetheless the man is obligated to make her his wife or to pay the penalty if that's impossible. And this might be worth discussing, although it's obviously very contentious. There's a pointer here to the sacrality of sex. And of course, in our culture, we're tempted to believe that sex can be mere enjoyment, a form of entertainment, I would say, a light form of entertainment even. And that the reason that that's the case is because, in principle, we have reliable birth control, and so the consequences of the sexual act that have been lessened in their heaviness. And so then the question opens up in front of us: if we have reliable birth control, is sex then now to be properly regarded as just another form of entertainment, or does it carry with it the burden of something approximating permanent relationship? And my sense is that even though the technology has enabled us to prevent the ultimate consequences of the act, I don't believe that mitigates the seriousness of the interaction. And I think the fact that we've lost that has damaged intimate relationships almost beyond repair by making the part of them that is most significant emotionally and physically into something that's now as trivial as the lightest of entertainment. I don't think it's done us well, and obviously that's quite a conservative position in the political sense, but everything I see going on around me seems to point to...
Conservative or rational? I'm not being cute. Why is it conservative? Conservative might be prescriptive, but what you've described, I read over and over in left-wing sources, in progressive sources, how many depressed young women there are in the culture of our what is it called again? The
hookup.
The hookup culture.
Yeah, right.
Very few people would say that this has benefited women.
Well, I also see in the left-wing culture there's this strange splitting of attitude towards sexuality. And so on the one hand, there's this proposition that every possible variant expression of sexual desire and action is not only permissible, but to be celebrated in a mandatory manner. But simultaneously, every single interaction that's even vaguely sexual between a young man and a young woman is so pregnant with danger, so to speak, that it has to be reduced to an explicit contractual arrangement before it can even be undertaken. And so I think the fact that both of those tendencies exist on the left simultaneously, the left being that part of our political discourse that tends toward the breaking of arbitrary constraints, that's an indication that there's some underlying set of regulating principles that's been violated. You get an excess in libertinism on the all sexual proclivities are to be celebrated front, and the simultaneous legalism that emerges, because that does put young women in uncomfortable situations that are extraordinarily hard on them. So you get questions arising, for example, well, can a young woman give consent to a sexual interaction of any sort if she's intoxicated by alcohol? And it isn't the right-wingers who are bringing up that issue fundamentally. It's the left-wingers, and their answer is, well, no, absolutely not.
That's a contradiction of tectonic proportions
absolutely.
within that worldview.
What it isn't a contradiction with, though, is this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not reciprocal. This is this is saying that if I don't see here an equal and opposite commandment. If a woman entices a man to sleep with him, then she's
forced to marry him. Right?
No, this is the view here is that men have an absolute responsibility not to engage in commitmentless sex, and that to do so is to take or do something that is not reciprocal, and you know. So conservatives who want to point out these hypocrisies in the left should have to grapple with whether they are prepared to speak a kind of truth to power to men and say this is intrinsic to your masculinity, is to take responsibility in this regard.
There's that famous documentary that came out recently, What is a Woman? And there's actually a biological answer to that question. There's a multitude of them. One of them is, maybe you could say this, that's the principle of the biological reality, is that the female is that sex which takes primary responsibility for reproduction and bears disproportionate weight in doing so. That's what constitutes female. And that's true right at the level of sperm and ova. And it propagates, it's fractal. And so the reason it's the man that's taking advantage here is because the price he'll pay for it is nowhere near as high as the price she'll pay for it, either emotionally or conceivably practically. And so it is fundamentally his sin, right? And I think it's very much...
The confusion in the young, I mean, so I work in a very odd kind of college. It's a good one. But we figured out that the kids don't understand much about sex. And so we started offering a course called The Theology of the Body. And it is the most popular course on the campus now. And, you know, we're having to recruit half the faculty to teach it.
Because using the teachings of John Paul II?
Yeah, such things. You know, in other words, it's... they understand sex is very consequential, right? It's a big thing. And in what way is it a big thing? And how should you, because they want it, they're human. What is its purpose? And all of that, right? And it's not enough to say, because like we're talking about details here that are almost romantic, because the preciousness of a woman, her, we teach the young men, don't foul that. That's a wonderful thing, and they, listen, it's good for them.
Conservatives like to talk a lot about the hatred of men and the diminution and the problems in the education system. They're completely right to do so. But we really have to ask, I mean, to what extent some of it is a consequence of the abdication of fundamental responsibilities?
Yeah, well, I think it's not only an abdication of fundamental responsibilities, it's also a diminution of the pleasure principle itself, because I don't believe that it's unreasonable to make the presumption that there is no more sacred act than sexual congress in some fundamental sense. And then what that means is that to diminish that to the status of light entertainment is to take the thing in your life that could be among the highest and to make that nothing but that which is casual. And that means there's no increment on the hedonic side at all, quite the contrary. And I would say I think part of the evidence for that seems to be that more and more young people aren't having sex. They're not engaging in relationships. Well, they're not having sex with another person. I mean, pornography use is rife, although even there's now evidence that among young men, the proportion of young men who have zero sex, which includes even the use of pornography, has started to climb up dramatically. And so it could easily be that we put ourselves in a situation where making sex as freely accessible as possible and as casual as might be imaginable, has actually demolished its hedonic utility as well as its integration within a broader set of moral constraints.
This may be very obvious, but if you take your view, which I agree with totally, there's a way towards that, and this is safeguarding. In other words, the young man who's done that hasn't gone through the betrothal and the dowry and all that sort of stuff. So it's a protection of the very ways that the Jews saw you had to approach marriage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Isn't there also a sort of philosophical, anthropological paradox that some of the most animal aspects of human life are also the most distinctively non-animal at the same time? Mm-hmm. So, for example, the meal. Mm-hmm. You know, no other animal has a meal. And they feed, mm-hmm. But they don't have a meal together. So for us, the meal, it's no accident that in great religious traditions, a meal has profound symbolism. The Eucharist is one that springs to mind, but there are many others, of course. Exactly. Mm-hmm. This is the sacred. Mm-hmm. And isn't it also true with sexual relations that this is at the same time the most animal, and yet it's a point where we distinguish ourselves from all other animals, and it's precisely, I think.
I think that's an extremely wise point, also because it is the case that it's easy for the pull of our animal nature to entice us into a state of profound self-consciousness and shame. And that frequently happens, and I think it happens more often, to women who sleep around casually. And we could extend that to women who sleep around casually when they're intoxicated by alcohol and wake up the next morning and think, well, just what the hell did I do? And the shame emerges. And then you might say, well, what's the antidote to that shame? And it has to be perhaps that the pull of that animal nature has to be balanced by the sacralization of the enterprise, and that is the way, and that's the way out of the shame. And hypothetically, when you read about sexual utopian communes, for example, what's lurking in the background consistently is this idea that we could just, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just dispense with our shame of nakedness and with our sexual shame? And the proper response to that might be something like, well, you can't dispense with it. The best you can do is integrate it into a subsidiary structure and elevate it, and it's through the elevation that the shame is eradicated, but not as a consequence of the mere dispensation with shame, which isn't, I don't think, unless you're psychopathic, I don't think it's possible.
One little additional thought. I have spoken on campuses by sheer coincidence on some occasions, not most, but on some. It was Sex Week, which virtually every American campus has. I assume Canadian campuses have as well. And the campus is sort of drenched in sexual discussions, exhibitions, et cetera. And
I'm naive. I never heard of Sex Week.
Well, you're at Hillsdale.
You're at Hillsdale, yeah. There's no Sex Week at Hillsdale.
Week, yeah. If Hillsdale has Sex Week, invite me. And it was a little depressing, actually, and I think it became clear, I'm certainly not prudish on the matter, which sadly one always has to add when one discusses sex, which is a tragedy in and of itself. But in any event, I'm just thinking, and this is a wild thought, would the average student on an average campus be happier if there was a Bible week or a sex week? Just in terms of happiness.
Mm-hmm. So, I would also like to point out on the clinical front, just for the sake of argument, that there are markers of antisocial personality. And so that would be a proclivity towards the exploitation of others, the criminal exploitation of others. And that's a pretty stable pattern of behavior in human beings. It tends to last across the life course. It's very difficult to moderate with any psychological or sociological interventions. And there's a cloud of symptoms, patterns of behavior and thought that are associated with criminality, exploitative criminality. Predatory parasitism is the most extreme form of criminal proclivity. And one of the hallmarks of antisocial personality is multiple early sexual partners. And so the criminal types tend to engage in short-term mating strategies, and what that means is that they don't integrate their drive towards sexual gratification into any subsidiary structure. There's no long-term commitment to themselves or to other people. And I think that's very interesting that that is a hallmark of antisocial personality, because it makes you wonder then if the group of persons who is pushing hard for a kind of naive sexual libertinism on the grounds of hedonism, if that's also not expressed, under what circumstances that's also not an expression of this same kind of callousness, callous exploitativeness that's a hallmark of antisocial personality. It's a perfectly reasonable technical question, because the more civilized people, the ones who are farthest from criminal behavior, are those who are more likely to engage in stable, long-term, monogamous relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's clear. That's another example of this bottom-up propensity, right? There's a biological reality there too. Because you might say, well, the biological reality is that we're propelled by our lust, the biological drive, but it's way more complicated than that. There's also a drive towards the integration of sexuality into a higher order pattern of being that's much more stable and much more likely to be reproductively successful, for example. So psychopathy is 3% of the population. It's not a great reproductive strategy. It works better than it's better than not having sex at all. But it's not a good, long-term, stable reproductive strategy.
Can I ask about the next verse, 17? If the father refuses to give the maid over in marriage to the man, he has to pay money according to the dowry of virgins. What's going on there?
Well, it means that she is still not forced to marry him. Right. He entices her, he has to marry her. But what if the family refuses? And almost all of history, in every civilization until the modern, the family determined your spouse. So she's not forced to marry the man. Mm-hmm. That's what it says.
And the money is as if
he still has to pay a penalty.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
22:18, and let's do 22:18 and 19 together. Sure. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and whosoever lieth with a beast shall surely be put to death. So, anyone want to tackle the witch?
Oz had a good insight on this, and maybe you should want to show how they relate to each other.
I got it from the rabbis and Leon Kass.
Yeah. Cool.
In other words, again, your idea that the death penalty is not for everyone, that's important here. But Leon Kass says, we've come from Egypt and we're going to Canaan. And both of them destroy the boundaries. So you're made in the image of God. You are God-like, so you're not an animal. All you said about that is right. You're not an animal. But you are God-like, but you're not God. Now, the Egyptians were ones who destroyed the boundaries upwards through the mastery of technology and rationality. And the Canaanites were the ones who destroyed the boundaries downwards. So the Egyptians,
explain how did they do that?
The Canaanites?
How did they do that?
The Canaanites?
It's in that book you're talking about. What?
Yeah, through wild sexual frenzies, Dionysian festivals, and so on.
So a sinking back into unthinking
animal
nature.
Irrational, and so on. In other words, the boundaries are there because we're made in the image of God, and one way we try and break them is through the mastery of technology. We become gods. You think of Yuval Harari and people like that today. And what you're describing, the hookup culture, is the opposite. You destroy the boundaries downwards and just, indulge our animal nature.
When you say technology, you mean embalming and...
Well, in this context, presumably it would be sorcery is an attempt.
I mean, the desire to control the world
in a godlike way through power. Yeah.
And then remember, Moses' opponents were sorcerers in Egypt.
So the idea would be that it's two verses that are related to each other. One which is, do not make yourself like a god and try to control the world through power, but then also do not become like an animal and join yourself with an animal. And it's explicit, right? Don't have sex with animals, but it also brings about just the notion of don't let yourself fall into that animal state at the same time.
And why would you associate specifically the prohibition against allowing a witch to live? Are you associating
not
that
a witch? John should come in here. No, this is the Egyptian sorcerer who was the secret arts.
They
of
are related, though. You're right.
But it's important to say.
Both destroy boundaries.
Yeah. But it's important to say. I mean, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but for people who watch and will have been told the worst aspect of history, Christian witch burning is very much misunderstood by most people. In fact, witch burning was a pagan practice. It wasn't just something that you find in the Bible, but witch burning was a Roman practice. And in fact, in the transition into Christianity, witch burning was prohibited. We never find any witch burning in Constantinople. And witch burning is prohibited in the West. For example, Charlemagne made a funny statement. He made it into a joke. He said, if anybody burns a witch, they will be burned alive. And so it's only in the very early modern times that witch burning comes back. So 16th century. Sorry?
Why is that funny?
It's funny because it's like saying if you burn a witch, then the consequence will fall back on you. It was trying to make an irony out of the situation, because they actually said that witchcraft was nonsense. And the early Christians thought witchcraft was just hocus pocus. It was total nonsense. And it's only in the 16th century into the 17th century that witch burning comes back, and mostly through secular courts. The Catholic Church actually did not engage with the hammer of witches and all of the kind of crazy stuff that was going on in the European world. And so the Enlightenment folks, they projected witch burning back into the Middle Ages when it was in fact something of their own time.
So I understand Oz's point about technology, and I'll just mention that C.S. Lewis says that in the early Renaissance, late medieval, there was a contest between magicians and science, and they wanted the same thing. They wanted to control nature. They wanted to overcome God, and that magic was impotent and science was strong, and so it replaced it.
This is Keith Thomas's thesis, I think, isn't it?
But I think this double drive, mastery and merging, is so strong today. And you know, the rationalist, secularist, man as God, and on the other hand, the merging.
No, you're right.
No, it's very interesting way of conceptualize the
no binaries.
Yeah, well, that's a degeneration into chaos on the one hand, and an elevation into a kind of rigid technocracy on the other. Yeah, and we do see that playing out in our culture with the increasing proclivity of globalist utopian leaders to adopt a top-down Tower of Babel approach, and also the insistence that we merge back into an undifferentiated nature on the hedonistic side.
Exactly.
So instead of, that's a chaos, excessive chaos and excessive order problem
this is
as
what
well.
C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man in, I think, one of the great works of the 20th century. It's a rather small text, but it is a but it's I think a prophetic work.
And you read it in light of the boundary issue that Oz is laying forth.
Yes, I mean it's a pronounced critique of relativism and subjectivism. So it starts off with a reference to Coleridge, and it's a passage taken from a school book, a textbook at the time, exactly, for the 1940s. I think they've actually discovered which textbook it was. And Coleridge is describing the appearance of a waterfall and criticizing the one observer who says that the sublime waterfall is pretty. And Coleridge makes the point, no, this is an error. And in the textbook that Lewis is criticizing, the view is, well, of course this is absurd because we merely project our